Well, welcome back. I hope you've had a nice cup of tea and the weather isn't too horrendous where you are. Certainly in the UK here, it's just cold, dry and very cold. So let's get on with the lecture from our next presenter, who is Dr. Peter Kennedy, well known to us at the BBKA, and we've supported quite a fair bit of his research, which has been excellent. He's based at the University of Exeter in the Environmental and Sustainability Institute, and his interest has been beneficial insects, particularly social and pollinating insects. He's done a lot of work on those, but with the arrival of the Asian hornets, he's been working very much on the emerging threat of them and the development of radio telemetry. But I think it's probably better for me to let Pete to carry on and talk about his research himself. So welcome, Pete. Thank you. If you'd like to take over.
Great. Thank you very much, Anne. Good afternoon to everybody. Just a moment while I just arrange to share the screen. And if you could maybe just confirm that you can see the screen.
Yes, we can, Peter. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. Right, so I'm from the University of Exeter, but based in Cornwall at the Penryn campus, and working in the Environment and Sustainability Institute. We are currently working on two funded projects dealing with the Asian hornet. So we have a BBSRC funded project that is hoping to measure and model the threat posed by the Asian hornet to managed and wild pollinators. This actually has a generous funding also from the BBKA, which will allow us to do some additional sampling within this project. And then there's also an EU Interreg project, the Atlantic Positive project that you would have heard a little bit about from Sandra. So this is a partnership across 10 partners in covering Portugal, Spain, France, the UK and Ireland, and is intended to bring sort of ideas, experiences together to try and develop methodologies and strategies to help contain the spread of the Asian hornet in Europe, and in particular in the Atlantic area of Europe. So the focus of our research across these two projects broadly fits into sort of four categories. So that we are working on the aspect of the Atlantic Positive project in terms of nest detection and trying to improve on methodologies around this, particularly in regard to radio telemetry, and to help sort of enable people to utilize these techniques. We're also helping in terms of providing training aids for partners, stakeholders and agencies dealing with the Asian hornet. And as I mentioned with the BBSRC project, we're obviously very interested in getting a better measure of the impact of the Asian hornets on wild, but especially wild pollinators, because that's probably an area where we know the least about at the moment. So this covers a range of things, including getting a broader understanding of their diet spectrum, understanding how predation influences bee behavior, bee dynamics, and potentially pollination services. There's also, obviously, both of these things will feed into the models that we are trying to develop to allow us to make predictions on the impact when Asian hornets might potentially reach the UK. But that will have to come after we've sort of generated the data from the earlier studies, obviously also taking into account what is being published in the literature. And ultimately trying to develop sort of national and regional control strategies, or rather reviewing existing ones and developing a potential transnational strategy to constrain the spread of the Asian hornet in Europe. So the bits that I'm going to focus on in this talk are actually the two first parts, as the other two will lead from those. So nest detection, ultimately well, I guess there's a general consensus amongst research scientists that if you are going to be able to constrain the spread of the Asian hornet and manage its population growth in Europe, that you need to deal with the reproductive unit. Now, the reproductive unit is either the whole colony, the mated queen, or aspects that influence her fertilization. There are various control methods that have been put forward that if they don't fall into the category of dealing with the reproductive unit, then they are dealing more with trying to manage the impact of the Asian hornet, typically at a specific locality, often the apiary, but they often don't have an influence on population growth or the impact that the Asian hornets might exert away from the apiary. There's some controversy about spring queen trapping and its value. You would have heard Sandra talking about this as well. So there's concerns about the levels of bycatch that are caught in the process of trying to catch the emerging queens in the spring versus the actual efficiency of being able to catch spring queens. But there's actually a multi-year French study that has been going on for a few years now. So there, as part of that, there will be a scientific evaluation of how spring trapping has worked in 15 municipalities across France. And I believe that is soon to conclude, so hopefully we'll learn more from that. But ultimately, when it comes down to this, I might obviously talk about dealing with the reproductive unit, detecting the nest. The biggest challenge you have there is detecting it. And that is maybe illustrated by sort of photographs from various locations. These photographs, I think a fair number of them I've actually taken from Jersey. Just to illustrate that nests aren't always easy to find. They can be either high up in trees, often hidden by the dense leaf canopy that exists during the summer period. They could even be in clipped hedges, under roof tiles, within bramble, or in really inaccessible places where you even need sort of high-tech equipment to be able to reach the nests. And as Alistair Christie, no doubt, I'm not sure if he's joined this meeting, but he will attest to the difficulties of locating nests in marsh amongst reeds and thistles, etc., which wasn't easy to hack one's way through just to even get close to the nest. So there is a long tradition of actually hunting for hornets in Asia, or rather in parts of Asia, particularly away from the sea where protein may not be so easily accessible. Typically the way it would be done is that someone would put bait out to try and trap the hornet. This could be a live insect that is just sort of pinned down to a stick. With the idea of if the hornet's actively foraging an area, they will be attracted by this, and somebody is patiently waiting there to attach either a thread or a sort of silk streamer to the hornet to make it more visible as it flies away, with the idea of then being able to follow the hornet more easily. This might have to be repeated a few times until the nest is located. That sort of approach is what's being used to some extent in Europe. So in France, Spain, and the Channel Islands, they have people have attached sort of streamers to them. But the general idea is that you mark a hornet, that you try and see what vanishing direction it flies to, and potentially even time its time away so that you can get an idea of distance. And this has been used effectively in Mallorca. So on Mallorca, it was wildlife rangers who had responsibility for trying to find the nests. They would use fish bait that would be hung up in a tree, hopefully a tree where there was sort of lots of open space around, so you can see the hornets flying away from that location. The hornet would be attracted by the smell, would take a chunk of meat away and want to return this to the nest. And it's then a case of taking a compass bearing of the direction it flies to. The wildlife rangers in Mallorca are actually very experienced in tracking a whole range of wildlife. They typically deal with migratory birds passing over the island, and therefore very experienced in following sort of flying animals as they sort of move through the sky. So for them, they probably had a little bit of an advantage in terms of following the hornets through binoculars as well. On Jersey, the same sort of approach is used. Here, the hornets are attracted in using a sugar-rich bait. So tissue would be soaked into what often was sotera or trapit to attract the hornets in. The hornets would be marked, their visits would be timed, and vanishing directions noted. And then the bait stations would often be moved along a vanishing direction, bringing you ever closer to where the nests might be. The hornets would find the bait station, the relocated bait stations, and you would again take sort of vanishing directions and timings from these. And ultimately, it would allow you to sort of narrow in into onto the search area or the likely area where the nest was located, and be able to triangulate from different locations onto that particular point. Nigel Semmons described this also for the UK. In Galicia, a similar sort of method is being used. There they prefer to use protein, which could either be bits of chicken, fish, shellfish. And in a similar way, the hornets are caught, they're marked, but they often then returned back onto the protein bait, allowing the hornets to take a parcel of meat and then carry it back to the nest. And from sort of timings of that hornet returning back to the bait station, flying back out to the nest, you get a sense of distance, you get repeat sort of ideas of the direction that the nest is, allowing you to already sort of from one bait station already make a very rough estimate of the potential location of the nest. This would allow you to then set up another bait station that would be closer to that location, maybe off to the side, allowing you to get another angle to home in on a potential nest area. You may need a third bait station or more, depending on the difficulty of the location. But eventually you are triangulating in on the most likely area to search to find the nest. And the same approach has been used very effectively by the MBU. So they have used both sugar-rich baits as well as protein baits, and on different occasions. And as Nigel described, have become very efficient at locating nests via this method. Right at the very start of when Asian hornets first arrived in the UK in 2016, we were actually approached by DEFRA to explore whether technology might actually help in terms of the efficiency of locating Asian hornet nests. And this led to a publication that came out in 2018, where in essence we described the front runner from the various technologies we looked at, which was radio telemetry. Now, radio telemetry is something that has been used for well over 50 years. It's typically used and proven its use in wildlife tracking. So we have off-the-shelf, ready-to-use equipment, which is obviously a great start rather than developing something necessarily bespoke. And we also know that this can be used to not only track individuals, but by tracking those individuals, even being able to follow social groups. So whether that's wild dog packs or whether that's lion prides, ultimately you could follow a social group around via this method. So the challenge with, obviously, with hornets or any sort of insect is that the size of the radio tags that you can use. But this is where there have been advancements in the technology. So the size of tags has been reduced. So now we are often dealing with tags that are less than 0.3 grams in weight. And actually quite small, just sort of a few millimeters in size, well, possibly up to a centimeter in length, with a sort of attached aerial to this as well. Being small in size, obviously it's small weight, it does limit the size of battery that you can use with them. So the battery life on these tags is typically sort of lasts for a few days to maybe a few weeks, depending on the type of tag that you're actually using. Detection ranges are approximately 1 kilometer, sort of in open environment, which is very usable, seeing as we know from other studies that a lot of the foraging by Asian hornets happens within 1 kilometer of the nest, and in fact, sort of a large proportion of it even within 500 meters of the nest. The operation of telemetry equipment is relatively straightforward, does need a little bit of training to be able to learn to interpret the signals that you're receiving. But with a little bit of practice, you can use these, most people can use these techniques. And vegetation has relatively minimal impact, as you would have seen from the previous slide. This can, radio telemetry has been used in open landscapes as well as in sort of jungle forests. So it's very versatile. There are costs obviously associated with radio telemetry. So you'd typically have a one-time cost of purchasing your receiver and antenna. But probably more critical for a lot of people is the price tag for the radio tags, which is currently sort of around £145 for one of these tags, which seeing as they have got a limited life span is a potential issue. What we have got better at is actually being able to reuse radio tags, so that if we find a nest relatively quickly, we can basically disable the radio tag, save the battery, and then be able to reuse it on another occasion. So this is an example of me following a hornet. This was actually the very first hornet that we successfully followed to find a nest back in 2017. We were working at the INRA Bordeaux research facility. They had an apiary. So if you look on the left-hand side, you will see there's a yellow dot with an arrow, which is actually the apiary. And this is where the hornet was released. It flew in that sort of south easterly direction from the apiary. Unfortunately, we weren't able to follow that hornet directly because there was a 6-meter perimeter wall around this research facility. So we had to go via the road, whiz around to where the residential area was on the other side of the wall, and then try to pick up the signal again. But this actually illustrates also a really good point. You don't need to follow the hornet directly. You could choose your path and then reacquire the signal and then decide in which direction to go based on where that signal is coming from. And on this occasion, we followed the road along until we were picking up signal a little bit further. In this particular location, we were slightly confusing signals because we're working in an urban area. You do get some signal bounce off buildings. So we were getting signal from opposite directions, but it's just a case of then relocating yourself to a better location where there's a clearer signal. And this sort of led us to move further eastwards. slightly upwards from there, only to find that the hornet had been stationary but now had relocated again. So we continued following downwards in a southerly direction until it eventually led us to the nest location. This was approximately, it was over 500 meters from the apiary where we released the hornet. Again, sort of feeding into the information of what we know in terms of their foraging range. But it's also a very good example of how radiotelemetry helps to for you to find a nest relatively quickly. We found this nest within 45 minutes of the release of the hornet. Typically, I would say that that was a good example. Sometimes we were working maybe 2 to 3 hours after the hornet has been released before we locate a nest. Obviously, we don't find a nest on every single occasion, but we are able to return a following day to try again and potentially try with a different hornet. But we have good success, over 60% of the hornets we have released have resulted in us finding a nest. Here's some other examples. So the picture on the left is on Jersey, where the hornet was released near the sort of top of the coast, near the footpath. The hornet dropped down, flew sort of over a mixture of brambles and bracken, etc., dropped right down and this basically disappeared from view. And it was a case of us then following. So the yellow line indicates the likely path of the hornet, or actually sort of a fairly straight line that the hornet is likely to have taken to the nest. The blue line shows then how Alistair and myself moved along the paths available to us to be able to follow the hornet as best we could until we eventually tracked her down at the nest. So we were receiving the signal when the hornet had reached the nest. The same on the right. This is an example from Galicia, where I was working with Sandra Rojas. And here there was a relatively large apiary that was being plagued by sort of easily 100 hornets per day across the whole apiary, that is. And we caught a number of hornets, chose the best one that we thought we would track on this occasion, a relatively large hornet, released it. And then the blue line again shows the path that we took as we then try to sort of follow the hornet as best we could, using what paths were available to us. So crossing a road, going up into a eucalyptus forest, going sort of beyond where we maybe should have gone, but that was partly also due to there being a canyon that we couldn't quite bypass and had to find a route sort of around until eventually we found the nest high up in a conifer within the middle of this eucalyptus forest. This is a sort of very fortunate photograph. This was taken in the New Forest. It's fortunate in as much that I was actually able to capture our tagged hornet in flight, carrying the radio tag. So the nest wasn't as obvious as this when we were searching for it. This was after the tree surgeons had climbed up in preparation for the nest being treated. They'd already removed some of the branches around it, and in the process of doing so, disturbed the hornet, so she flew off the nest. But here she's returning back onto the nest, and I've actually also took photographs of her then being on the nest integument as such. And obviously, you would have heard, no doubt, it was in the press about the murder hornet, Vespa mandarinia, sort of being in British Columbia and in Washington State. So I got in touch at the start of last year with the Washington State Department of Agriculture, and so basically discussed similarities between what they would be dealing with and obviously the situation with the Asian hornet in Europe. yeah, in essence, sort of just offered sort of whatever advice I was able to provide them. So the first sightings were in December 2019. These are the first confirmed sightings, but it actually subsequently transpired that the hornets had already been seen in October, but the reports hadn't been submitted. So amongst those, also the beekeeper who actually discovered his bees had been killed by hornets, only discovering the dead bees afterwards, but the evidence was very clear that this would have been Vespa mandarinia. So queens were then found in May, June 2020, which confirmed successful overwintering, because obviously the initial thought was, would they overwinter? And clearly they could. And then also workers were being trapped in September, showing that the queens had been able to sort of found their nests. One of the difficulties that they instigated a very effective trapping system. They got there was a big citizen science campaign, getting lots of people to put traps out. But these were largely kill traps, such that although they were getting reports of where the hornets were being caught, unfortunately, it didn't give them material to be able to track a hornet, to potentially find the nest. So this in September, then they introduced their track not whack campaign with the idea of trying to catch live hornets rather than killing them on site. So that happened in September. Washington State Department of Agriculture had an arrangement with the University of Washington where they were developing Bluetooth devices to potentially track insects. So they were exploring these first, but I may have potentially sort of missed an early opportunity, but soon realized that the Bluetooth devices just didn't have the range that they would need to be able to follow the hornets to their nest. So sort of following possibly on the recommendation that I'd given them earlier, switched to radio telemetry. So on the 22nd of October, they attached a radio tag onto their first hornet, and they found the nest later on that day, sort of just 200 meters away from where it had been released. So that obviously led to the nest being found very unusually in a tree some distance off the ground. Vespa mandarinia would normally nest underground or possibly near ground level, but this was I think it was sort of about 6-7 foot off the ground and they were accessing a cavity via a crack in the tree. The image on the bottom right is showing you where they then actually felled that tree, cut the section with the nest in, took it into a cold room to then split it open to reveal the nest and be able to sort of collect various data from that nest. So we have got ongoing work sort of amongst our projects, both the Interreg and the BBSRC project. And in particular, we are interested in exploring some new radio tags that the suppliers made us aware of at the start of last year. We were hoping to test these sort of fully already last year, but unfortunately COVID intervened. But these are one of the very interesting aspects about these tags is that their weight is about half the weight of the radio tags that we would normally use. So giving us the opportunity to track hornets that are sort of a lot smaller than we would otherwise be able to track. So actually here just an example of one of these radio tags on an Asian giant hornet. The image on the bottom right is showing you the Asian hornet with the radio tag on there just for size comparison. And obviously I mentioned that we are developing training materials. So we've got a detailed manual. We're sort of finalizing a step-by-step guide, and we started sort of putting together some draft training videos, and we've already been able to share these with various interested authorities. Obviously AFA, National Bee Unit, have been introduced into our radio telemetry, and that very much part of the DEFRA funded work. So this is something that they have got in their back pocket should they require it. But states of Jersey, states of Guernsey are also using radio telemetry, exploring it more. But also Switzerland, they have used radio telemetry to find their first nests. Hamburg, the 4 nests that they found in 2020 are on the basis of using radio telemetry. Itzap and Adapi in France have received training from us and have found their sort of first nests. And similarly, in Belgium, in Flanders, the group there are exploring radio telemetry, and obviously Washington State Department of Agriculture. I shouldn't forget to mention here that obviously in the UK, releasing and tracking an invasive alien species is reserved for authorized agencies only. So this image, just to quickly remind me that I'm changing tack a little bit. So moving on to the diet of Asian hornets. So we know in its native range that that it feeds on honeybees, but we know relatively little about the breadth of the diet. There's sort of anecdotal reports if you really sort of search through the literature, sort of them feeding on bumblebees, social wasp flies, dragonflies, spiders, and collecting sort of carrion or going to sort of flesh, etc., to find for protein. In Europe, we also know that they predate honeybees, but we still have that lack of information really of what their impact is on wider biodiversity. As was mentioned earlier in the day, sort of estimates of the impact in terms of honeybee colony losses sort of range between 5 to 80%, where that loss isn't just necessarily a sort of complete loss, but it also includes the weakening of colonies beyond point of viability. So this, and this largely from those areas where the hornets are already well established, so there are some sort of reasonable nest densities present there. There was work done by the French Natural History Museum, sort of around 2009. It was published also in 2011, and this in essence they were catching hornets as they were returning to their nest, carrying these prey pellets, removing the prey pellets off them, and then sort of microscopically dissecting them to find recognizable body parts that could give them a clue to the insects involved. So with the photographs on the right, you've got an Asian hornet feeding on a hoverfly. It carries the prey pellet back to the nests, and ultimately what you're doing is you teasing that prey pellet apart to try and see what you can find. So actually the image on the bottom of those sets of 3 is a hoverfly as it would be macerated by an Asian hornet. Having identified those insects, they've actually discovered not only the groupings of insects that the hornets feed on, and it differs from location to location. But typically sort of around 1/3 of the prey returned would be bees, but equally there would be wasps and flies and other insects within this. But they also found that 1/3 of the prey that they had collected, they could not identify. They'd just either been too macerated, or maybe there were soft body tissues that really didn't have any sort of skeletal parts that were recognizable. That 1/3 isn't represented in the pie charts that are above there. And it's typically sort of assumed that, well, they'd be equally, all the different groups would be equally represented within that sort of unidentified section, and therefore not alter the proportions. But actually, if we look at an earlier study, which was done with a wasp that we're more familiar with, so this is the German wasp or European wasp, Vespula germanica. This is invasive in certain parts of the world. Here in this particular paper, this was in southern Australia, where there was concern that or what its impact might be in terms of replacing the existing sort of insect predator. So up until before the point of the arrival of the European wasp here, the predominant wasp in the region was Polistes humilis. There was concern as to whether there was maybe some sort of niche overlap in terms of whether they were going for the same types of prey and would there be consequences for the predator. So could this lead to some level of sort of competition for resources, reduction in fecundity, affecting the survivorship or population growth of the native species, and thereby also actually change the insect community? I mean, if you've got a new predator coming in that has maybe got different efficiencies and hunting for certain prey over others from the native one, it could actually change the structure of the local insect community. So they did very similar work to sort of what the French Natural History Museum did in terms of collecting prey pellets of returning foragers. And here they found that actually quite a large proportion were flies that were caught, but there were also Hymenoptera, Lepidoptera, wasps and moths and butterflies and spiders. But again, they found a third of the prey pellets couldn't be identified to any particular order as such, any particular taxonomic group. But here they actually used molecular techniques. So they took this third and then looked for whether there was any recognizable DNA within those samples that would basically allow you to identify the sort of likely sort of candidate for insect it might have been that was that prey pellet. Oops, going the wrong way. So the results from that actually showed that the assumption made before that all groups are equally represented in this unidentified grouping was actually not true. There were certain groups that were sort of more prominent than others. So you can sort of particularly see that flies and the moths and butterflies and the spiders were made up of, had a greater sort of pie section than the others. So the consequence of that, when you put it all together, is that obviously some of the proportions change. So flies now make up about half of the food these wasps are catching. But also we noticed that they're catching a greater proportion of moths and flies than we thought, but actually a smaller proportion of bees and wasps. So one obviously has to be careful in terms of what assumptions one makes about unidentified sort of remains as such. And similar work was also done in Hawaii, where another invasive species, which this one has come in from USA, arrived in the 1980s. This is Vespula pennsylvanica. So there was concern that this particular species seems to be showing huge trait plasticity since its introduction. And basically, a main concern was that in the USA, a usually very small percentage of them might turn out to be perennial. They're typically an annual sort of species, where it's again sort of queens, as we're familiar, sort of overwintering, but the rest all dying. But here, these perennial colonies are actually able to grow because they don't actually decline at the end of the year. They carry on into the next year. So they had examples of nests growing up to 600,000 individuals, and obviously they're potentially having a big impact. So again, they used molecular techniques and worked out what prey the species was feeding on. They identified that it was feeding on both introduced and native species, but often that there were small inconspicuous prey items that could easily be underestimated by the sort of microscopic techniques. Another interesting thing was that they actually did an experiment where they removed colonies from certain areas and compared them with control areas. And here they were able to show that spiders and caterpillars actually made remarkable recoveries once a colony had been removed, demonstrating the impact that these wasps were having on the native insect fauna. So going back to Asian hornets, when obviously we've heard more recently, there's the Rome et al. 2021 paper. It's just come out recently. And here this is the French Natural History Group actually using molecular techniques to reanalyze the prey pellets that they collected in 2008 to 2010. So now this paper deals with using a combination of microscopic and molecular approaches. They were able to identify 50 taxonomic families, 159 species, really showing just how opportunistic this predator is, in that it can pretty much accept most insects as sort of food. Honeybees obviously still make up quite a chunk, so just over a third of the prey caught were honeybees, APD. Then we also have wasps, and then there's also quite a large chunk of of flies, where there'll be blowflies, houseflies, hoverflies, flesh flies, just a diversity of flies. So it's obviously a very interesting study, but I guess there's maybe one or two points to consider. And that is actually when you look at the data in terms of the prey pellets that were collected, they didn't always have opportunity to return back to a nest over and over again. Whereas a few nests, they were able to do so, which basically meant that actually over 80% of the prey pellets that they analyzed came from just 4 nests that were within about 20 kilometers from one another. So in some ways, it's a sort of a localized study that we just need to interpret, knowing that that is the case. And it's also interesting then, if you look at what the habitat was like around those nests. So this figure here shows you the proportions of different urban, farmland, woodland, and water bodies around each of the different nests. And one thing that sort of strikes you from this figure is that they are very similar in that farmland and woodland was the sort of dominant habitat around the majority of these nests. So this is where we are actually sort of quite excited in terms of being able to contribute to this. My colleague, Juliette Poidat, who's come over from France to join us at the University of Exeter, she is working on the BBSRC project. And as part of this, we are planning to do sort of diet analysis from Asian hornet nests. We have, through the kind help of colleagues in France and Channel Islands, particularly sort of with COVID, we had difficulty in going to collect as many nests as we had hoped to, but thankfully others has helped us out. So we have over 40 nests that were sampled last year, mainly from the Aquitaine area around Bordeaux, but also from the Channel Islands of Jersey. And if you look at the similar sort of figures at the bottom of this picture, you will see that we've got much greater diversity of habitats around these nests. So we're looking forward to the analysis that will start this year. This is being led by Professor Charles Tyler at our main campus in Exeter. Oh yes, and the open circle there is just showing where the Dordogne area is, where the Rome samples came from, Rome et al. Samples came from. And also leading on to our collaboration with Sandra Rojas. So we are looking at pollinator behavior and how this is affected by Asian hornets, particularly on floral resources. So how behavior of flower visitors is affected by the Asian hornet. There's a lot of video analysis that is being done, detailed recordings of visitation to flower patches by different insects in areas of both high and low Asian hornet activity. So there's various data being collected, and Juliette has been spending many, many hours trawling sort of through these videos, using, analyzing the videos with Boris. That's not our Prime Minister, but that is a software package that allows you to capture detailed observations. And obviously this will lead into our modeling work. So we're hoping to take the data that comes out of these various studies, feed them into Behave and Bumble Behave, which allow us to simulate the sort of development of colonies and also the foraging behavior of the members of those colonies under sort of the influence of different stresses. And here, this is where Asian hornets would come into this, and hopefully allowing us to make predictions on what their effects would be on managed and wild bees. And obviously, as part of the Atlantic Positive project, we are working on developing strategies, so reviewing sort of existing strategies, looking at common approaches, identifying best practices, and then hopefully sort of working towards developing transnational strategic plan that can be utilized in the Atlantic area and sort of the neighboring European areas as well. So I'd quickly just like to finish there just by thanking the various other partners, obviously, of the Atlantic Positive project, but particularly University of Vigo, the project partners in our BBSSC funded project, and my colleagues, so Juliette Osborne, Charles Tyler, Juliette Poidatz, and in France, Denis Thierry and Corinne Monsieux. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Peter. There's just a few, well, there's a lot of questions, but we're not going to get through them all now, but hopefully we can do it at 4:15.
Yeah.
So I'm going to just take a few now and we'll finish at 20 past as scheduled.
Okay.
So the first question I've got is, any signs of the cost of the transmitters dropping significantly?
Well, it's a question I have been asking of the suppliers, but unfortunately at the moment that doesn't seem to be the case. But it will come down to sort of the processes used in making them. The numbers required will obviously influence the investment in these processes. At the moment, the reason why the radio tags are still quite expensive as such is that they have to be largely handmade. So once that can obviously be more automated, that gives a lot more opportunity to increase volumes of production and then also reduce the costs. But I guess in terms of the costs, it's like Sandra was saying earlier, there's opportunity to invest to make yourself huge savings compared to what potentially you might be dealing with once the situation gets out of control. But obviously there's a multitude of tools in your toolbox to deal with this. Obviously there's cheaper methods that can be used, but radio telemetry does offer solutions in more complex situations.
Lovely. This is an observation from Jersey, I think, and they're just saying spring trapping done properly works. One of our Jersey volunteers caught 4 successive queens in the same modified trap with escape holes, and by monitoring the trap daily with no bycatch.
Yeah.
Got any comment on that?
No, I mean, I think I was trying to be a little bit too brief in my my description of things. So the issue with spring trapping is bycatch, but if you can avoid the bycatch by not using a killing trap and being able to monitor to release regularly, then obviously that negative side of spring trapping you have avoided. There's still the question, as Stephen Martin mentioned, that you can remove an awful lot of spring queens and not actually change the population that much. So we've seen this in areas of France where they have used spring trapping, where you're still getting sort of large numbers of secondary nests found despite the spring trapping. So it's not a solution in itself, but it's not to say that there isn't some element that it does help.
Okay. Next question is, how do hornets communicate with other hornets, re sources of forage?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I think Stephen Martin touched on this earlier. So they don't communicate in the same way that honeybees do in terms of providing information where forage is. there is a suggestion from other vespids or other wasps that there may be some following. So obviously they share food in the nest, and it may be that a forager sort of goes out having had an interesting meal, or meal that reminded it of a location where it had found food previously, and therefore goes to that location. Either it knows or it follows another hornet. But to be honest, we don't really know.
Okay, this is going to be the last question.
Yep.
And it's, can you not use ranging from the tag? I don't know what that means, ranging from the tag. I think that's what they're trying to get at.
Yeah, I'm not sure I quite understand the question.
Yeah, so can you use ranging from the tag, I think is the question.
Yeah.
Should I move on?
I'm still not quite sure. Might need to be rephrased a little bit in the,
Yeah.
and then taken up in the panel session.
Yeah, okay. I'm sure they'll come back to us. So we'll squeeze one last question in. How do you attach the radio transmitter to the hornets? Something so small would be difficult to handle with gloves on, and the hornets would be nasty to handle.
So we anesthetize the hornets when we are attaching the tags. We have attached tags onto the backs of hornets, which we can do reasonably safely, just by holding them in a sort of queen cage, etc. But the reality is that the weight of the tag, at least the weights of the tags we were using before, meant that they were top heavy and couldn't fly very good. We now have to attach them underneath, which puts you in close proximity of the stinger, and therefore we cold anesthetize them. In Galicia, they also working on the radio telemetry technique with us, and they are sort of exploring alternative ways of attaching the tag or anesthetizing the hornet. So they've also been exploring with carbon dioxide, but you sort of need to get the dose right. Obviously, otherwise, A, the hornet wakes up too quick, or B, it actually sort of feels sick after the anesthesia.
Oh, wow.
But in Galicia, they've had some success with the CO2.
Okay, that's it. Very interesting answer. Thanks for that, Peter. That's the last one. Thank
Okay.
you for your talk. We'll see you again at 4:15. For everybody else, we're going to have 10 minutes now, another break, and we'll be back at 3:30. So thank you, Peter.
Okay, thank you.